Emmett Coulter, 26 years old, sat where he always sat at the Renwick Grange dance, and the chair beside him stayed empty the whole night. He folded his hands in his lap. He watched a fiddle he could not hear. He did not leave. 4 years of it. At his own mother's table, his family talked around him, never to him. Once a neighbor, meant to be kind. The man cupped his 2 hands around his mouth and bellowed it out. Emmett, Uri. Shouting, and 40 people at a box supper heard the correction. Think about that. He was spoken at for 4 years, and never once spoken to. That same winter, in a cold upstairs bedroom, a 29-year-old woman that nobody in the township expected to marry wrote a letter to a bureau in Washington. She began practicing something in a hand mirror, and she told no one. Not the town. Not him. If you have ever been the only one willing to learn a hard thing, for someone the whole world had quietly given up on, then this story is for you. Before we go on, do something for me. Subscribe to the channel, and in the comments, tell me what city you're watching from. I read every one. Now let me take you back. Emmett Coulter came home to Renwick in the spring of 1919. Tipton County, Indiana. 2 generations of Coulters had worked that ground before him. 200 acres of black dirt that grew corn taller than a man. He had gone to France a farmer's son. He came back a soldier with a gold chevron on his sleeve, and 2 ears that heard nothing at all. They told him it happened near Exermont, in the Meuse-Argonne. A shell came down close, closer than a shell ought to come and leave a man standing. The blast took the sound of the world with it. He woke in a field hospital, and the nurse's mouth was moving, and there was nothing behind it. No voice, no ringing even, just a silence so complete it had a weight to it. Like water, like being at the bottom of the pond behind the barn, looking up. He learned the word for it later. Nerve deafness. They said it that slow, careful way doctors say a thing they cannot fix. Nerve deafness. Both ears. It would not come back. At Walter Reed, they had a program for men like him. There were more of them than you'd think. Boys who came home from the guns with their hearing burned out. The Army was teaching some of them to read lips, to watch a mouth and pull the words out of the shape of it. And there was a place in Washington, the Volta Bureau, that would mail the whole set of lessons to any deaf man who wrote and asked. Emmett sat through a few of the sessions. Then he left the hospital before he finished them. He was a farmer. He had 200 acres waiting. No use for it out here, he told them. And he went home to the corn. For a while he still talked. A man talks. It's the most natural thing in the world. He'd say good morning to his mother. He'd tell Roy which field to turn under. But here was the thing nobody had warned him about. He could not hear his own voice anymore. Not one word of it. And a voice you cannot hear, you cannot steer. It drifts. It rises. It gets too big for a room, and you never know. It was Ruth who told him first, gentle as she could. His mother. She wrote it on a scrap of paper at the kitchen table. You are talking loud, son. And he looked at it and felt his face go hot. Then it happened in church. Then it happened at the feed store, with men turning to look. Within a year of coming home, Emmett Coulter stopped speaking. He'd rather say nothing than say it wrong in front of the whole county. He chose the silence. He chose it the way you choose to stop touching a stove. And that is the part I need you to hold on to. He was not a bitter man. He was not a broken man. He got up before the sun. He worked his ground harder than any 2 hands in the township. He fixed what broke. He paid what he owed. He was, by every measure a farming county uses to measure a man, a good one. The war had taken his hearing. It had not taken 1 ounce of the rest of him. But a farm is a lonely place to be a young man, with no way to be told anything. Here is how his days ran. When there was business to do, Roy Tanner did the talking. Roy was the hired man. Good with stock, better with people. He carried a slate tablet in his coat, the kind a schoolchild uses. When somebody needed to reach Emmett, they'd take that slate and chalk their words on it and hand it over, and Emmett would read it and nod. That was the system. That was the door into the man. A gray slate tablet that anybody could write on. And here's the poison in it, the part that took me a while to see. Everybody read over your shoulder. You want to tell a deaf man something on a slate, you tell it to the whole room at the same time. There was no such thing as a word just for him. Not one. He could be shouted at. He could be chalked at. But nobody on this earth could lean in close and tell him a secret. Roy stood in for him everywhere it counted. At the grain elevator, when they weighed his corn, Roy said the numbers. At the sale barn, when the auctioneer's chant rolled out over the pens, Roy raised the hand and Roy called the bids. Emmett stood right there at the rail. His own cattle in the ring. His own money on the line. And he stood mute as a fence post while another man's voice did his business. He'd catch the numbers off the chalkboard when he could. He'd nod to Roy or shake his head. But the deal was Roy's mouth. Always Roy's mouth. A man who cannot speak for his own cattle starts to wonder, somewhere down deep, whether he owns them at all. There was a man watching that wondering. His name was Vern Ostrander. He was the loan agent for the Tipton Farmers Trust, and he had a smile like a man counting cards. Emmett carried a note on the place. $1,400. It came due the 1st of June, 1923. And Ostrander had let it be known, quiet around the edges of the feed store, that he did not expect that note to get paid. A deaf man can't run 200 acres, he'd say, easy, like he was talking about weather. Can't hear a bank call the note. Can't hear the market turn. He was betting on the default. He wanted the ground. 200 acres of Coulter black dirt, taken cheap off a man he figured couldn't hold it. And the whole legal weight of the trust behind him to do it. Remember Ostrander. He's circling this whole story, patient as a hawk. Now let me show you the 4 years the way they actually felt. Because isolated is a word, and it doesn't cut deep enough. You have to understand what a township like Renwick was in those days. The socials were everything. The Grange Hall put on dances. The Methodist church did ice cream socials in the summer. There were box suppers where the girls packed a basket and the boys bid on them, and the winning bid got to share the meal. That was how the young people of the county found each other. That was courtship. That was the whole machinery of two people becoming one household. And it ran on talk. On the murmured word. On the joke told low, so only she could hear it. On the whole soft private language of getting close to somebody. Emmett came to them. Ruth made sure of it. She'd get him into his good coat and drive him in, because she could not bear to watch her son sit home going gray and quiet at 26. And I believe she thought that if she just kept putting him in the room, someday the room would open up and take him in. It never did. He would find a chair along the wall, and the chair beside him stayed empty. Every dance, every supper, every social. Not out of cruelty now. That's the thing I want to be fair about. Nobody in Renwick hated Emmett Coulter. It was worse than hate in a way. It was embarrassment. Picture a girl of 19. She might have looked at him and thought he was a fine-looking man. And he was. But how does she say the first soft thing of her whole life to a man who can only be reached by shouting? How do you flirt on a slate tablet with your mother reading over your shoulder? You don't. You can't. So she sat somewhere else. Not because she was cruel. Because she was young, and it was hard, and there was an easier chair across the room. 40 times, 50 times, that empty chair. Every gathering the county threw. The man who came back deaf, and the seat beside him nobody would take. He knew it too. Don't think he didn't. He'd sit there with his hands folded and watch the dancers he couldn't hear the music for. And he learned to keep his face still. Real still. That's a thing men learn who get looked at with pity. You go still so nothing shows. I want you to meet the woman now. Because she was in those rooms too, all those years, and nobody was looking at her either. Cora Ainsley. 29 years old the spring this turns. She kept house for her father Harlan, who'd been a widower a long time and had gotten used to being tended. Cora cooked and cleaned and kept the accounts and sat with her father in the evenings while he read the paper out loud at her. And the township had done with Cora Ainsley what a township does with an unmarried woman of a certain age. They had filed her away. Spinster, settled, past it. The kind and terrible arithmetic of a small place had added her up years ago and put the total in a drawer. The town had even penciled in her ending. There was a widower storekeeper named Alton Pruitt, a decent man. Ran the general store, kept a clean shelf, had buried a wife and raised no fuss about it. And everyone, in that quiet way a county decides things without a vote, had decided that Cora Ainsley would eventually marry Alton Pruitt. It made sense. It was sensible. Two settled people, a store and a housekeeper. No fireworks, and no fuss. The town liked it fine. Nobody asked Cora. Here is what nobody in Renwick knew about Cora Ainsley. She watched. All those years of sitting quiet at the edges of things, all that being filed away and looked past, had turned her into the sharpest pair of eyes in the county. When you stop being looked at, you get very good at looking. And of all the people in all those loud rooms, she was the one who really saw Emmett Coulter. Not the pity version. Not the poor deaf boy version. She saw the man going still so nothing would show. And something in her, something she couldn't have named yet, leaned toward it. Then came the box supper, the one the whole county still talked about after. This was the public wound, laid open in front of everyone, and it's where Cora finally understood the thing that changed her life. It was crowded that night, 40 people, easy, in the Grange hall. The baskets were up for bidding, and the lamps were lit, and there was that warm, loud hum of a country supper going well. Emmett was there, in his chair, hands folded. And a neighbor. A good man, honestly. A well-meaning man named Asa Dell. Asa had had some business with Emmett and wanted to square it. And Emmett had said something back. And whatever Emmett said, he said it too loud, the way he did now, because he could not hear to soften it. Loud enough to turn heads. And Asa Dell, God help him, meant to be helpful. He wanted to let Emmett know, so Emmett wouldn't feel embarrassed later. So he cupped his hands around his mouth, and in front of the whole hall, over the top of all that warm murmur, he bellowed it. Emmett, you're shouting, and the room went quiet. That awful, total, well-meaning quiet. 40 faces turned, 50 faces, and every one of them had just watched a man get shouted at like a child for the crime of not being able to hear his own voice. Emmett's face closed. That's the only way I can say it. Whatever was in it went behind a door, and the door shut. Now here is the moment the whole story turns on, and almost nobody in that hall caught it. Cora Ainsley caught it. Standing off to the side, basket in her hands, she watched Emmett's face close. And she understood something that no one else in 4 years had understood. She understood that it had never really been about his ears. Think it through the way she thought it through. His ears were the wound the war gave him, but the wound the town gave him every day was different. It was this. Nothing said to him was ever private. Not one word in 4 years. Everything reached him on a slate the whole room could read, or in a shout the whole room could hear. He could be spoken at. He could never be spoken to. And you cannot court a person you can only speak at. You cannot fall in love across a slate tablet with 40 people reading along. There is no such thing as tenderness at a shout. That was it. That was the true wall around Emmett Coulter. Not silence. Silence he could have borne. It was that there was no door into him that a person could walk through alone. Every road to him was a public road. Cora Ainsley went home from that box supper, and she did not sleep. And somewhere in that long night, this filed-away spinster of 29 decided she was going to build a private door into a man the whole county spoke at and no one spoke to. She had no idea yet how. She only knew that somebody ought to, and that nobody else was going to. and that she had spent her whole life becoming exactly the sort of person who does a quiet, hard thing alone in a cold room. It was January of 1922. She remembered something. She'd heard it once, secondhand, the way you hear things in a store, that the army had taught some of its deafened men to read lips, and that there was a bureau in Washington, the Volta Bureau, that would mail the lessons to anyone who wrote and asked. She had filed that away too. Cora filed everything away. So she wrote the letter. She did it at night, at the little desk in the upstairs bedroom, after her father was asleep, and she did not tell him, and she did not tell a living soul. She addressed it to the Volta Bureau, Washington, and she asked them to send her everything they had on the reading of lips. The lessons came by mail some weeks later, in a plain wrapper, and she carried the package upstairs like it was made of glass. And then, Cora Ainsley began the strangest, loneliest schooling any woman in Tipton County ever gave herself. 5 months. That's what it took. 5 months, starting that January, alone in a cold upstairs bedroom, with the lessons spread on the bed and a hand mirror propped against the picture. She would read a lesson. Then she would watch her own mouth in the mirror and make the shapes. She'd say a word with no sound, the way he would have to receive it, and watch how the lips carried it and how they didn't. Some sounds you can see plain. Some sounds hide inside the mouth where the eye can't follow, and 2 different words come out looking exactly the same. And you have to learn to catch the meaning off the whole shape of the sentence instead of the letters. It is brutally hard. It is like learning to read in the dark. She did it at night because the nights were hers. She did it in the cold because a fire might wake her father and bring him to the door with a question she didn't want to answer. And I want to tell you the exact reason she told no one. Because this is the heart of who she was. She kept it secret because it might not work. And if it didn't work, then she would not have gone and made him hope for nothing. Do you understand what that is? That is a woman who loved a man before she had said one word to him, who was willing to do 5 months of the hardest labor of her life in secret and get nothing and have no one ever know she'd tried, rather than lift his hopes and then let them fall. She was not going to make him hope until she was sure she could deliver. That's not shyness. That's the deepest kind of care there is. And she added something the lessons never taught her. Because Cora, remember, was a watcher, and she had watched the real problem close up. Reading lips is fine, she thought, when there's a face to read and light to read it by. But what about the dark? What about a turned head? A wagon seat at night? A moment when a face isn't there to be seen? What about the private word? The one that mustn't cross a lit room where anyone could read it off her mouth the same as off a slate. So she invented her own second channel. She would trace block letters, one at a time, with the tip of her finger on the open palm of a hand. Capital letters, drawn slow and clear on the skin. A whole sentence, spelled out letter by letter into a person's hand, where no one else on earth could see it or hear it. 6 inches of skin, from the base of the palm to the fingertips. That was all the space she needed. A channel that ran through 6 inches of skin, silent, invisible, that a whole room full of people could be standing in and never know a single word was being said. She practiced that too, on her own left hand, in the dark, until her finger knew the letters without her eyes. She got to where she could spell a full thought into a palm in the black of a moonless night. She built the one thing Emmett Coulter had not had in 4 years. A way to be told a secret. And still she told no one. 5 months of it, and the town went right on filing her under spinster, and pencil and Alton Pruitt, and never once wondered what the Ainsley girl did up in that cold room at night. The first crack of it showing came at Pruitt's store, and it wasn't even about her love at all. It was about the money. Cora was at the counter one afternoon. Alton Pruitt was weighing out something, being decent and dull. And across the store, near the window, Vern Ostrander of the Tipton Farmers Trust stood talking low to another man, talking quiet, talking the way a man talks when he doesn't want to be overheard. But Cora Ainsley had spent 5 months teaching herself to pull words out of the shape of a mouth, and she was standing at a slight angle, with the window light falling right across Ostrander's face. And without deciding to, without even meaning to, she read him. Clean across the room. Every word off his lips like he'd handed her a note. She read him say that the Coulter note came due the 1st of June. The next year, 1923. $1,400. She read him say the deaf man wouldn't pay it, couldn't pay it, wouldn't even rightly know when the trust closed on him. She read him lay out, in the smug private confidence of a man who thinks no one can hear, that he intended to let that note run to default on purpose. And take the 200 acres. Cora stood at that counter, with her heart going like a hammer, and her face like she was only thinking about the price of thread. She had just overheard a plan to steal a man's farm, in a room where the man who made the plan believed himself perfectly private. Ostrander thought no one in that store could reach his words. He was wrong, by one woman. The one nobody looked at. She did not say anything to Pruitt. She did not say anything to anyone in the store. She took her things, and she walked out into the cold, and her mind was already running ahead. Because now she knew a thing that could ruin Emmett Coulter, and she was the only person on the outside who knew it. So she went to Ruth, Emmett's mother, and she found a way to warn her, careful, without ever once explaining how she came to know. She let Ruth understand that the trust meant to let the note default and take the ground. That Ostrander was counting on it. That they had to get ahead of that 1st of June and not trust the man an inch. Ruth pressed her, of course. How do you know this, Cora? Who told you? And Cora only said that she'd heard it, that it was true, that it didn't matter how, that what mattered was the acres. And Ruth, frightened for her son, took the warning and let the how of it go. That was the first inkling anyone in Renwick got, that Cora Ainsley could do a thing no one else could do. That there was a channel open in her that ran clean across a crowded room and pulled words right off a careless man's mouth. Ruth didn't understand it, but she filed it away. And she started, without quite knowing why, to look at the Ainsley girl a little differently. Now the winter and the spring were gone. 5 months of secret schooling were behind her. Cora Ainsley could read a face across a room and spell a sentence into a palm in the dark. She had the skill. She had the plan. She had, sitting in her chest like a coal she'd been carrying so long, she'd stopped noticing the burn, the whole weight of what she meant to do. What she did not have, yet, was the nerve to do it. Because building a door in secret is one thing. Walking up to a man in front of people and opening it, that's another. Every day she'd wake and think, today, and every day the size of it would rise up in front of her. What if she'd learned it wrong? What if he pulled his hand back? What if he looked at her the way he'd taught his face not to look, and she saw pity there, but this time it was his pity. For her. The spinster who'd gone and learned a whole silent language for a man who'd never asked her to. What if the first private word said to Emmett Coulter in 4 years landed wrong, and she made it worse? She'd carried it alone, so it couldn't hurt him. Now the only way forward was to stop carrying it alone. It was early June when the chance came, and it came at a church supper, and the whole thing hinged on a chair. The Methodists had put on a social, and the tables were long and full, and Emmett was there. Of course he was there. Ruth had brought him. And he'd found his chair, the way he always found his chair, off toward the end, with his hands folded and his face gone still. In the warm, loud room he could not hear one note of. And beside him, the way there always was, an empty seat. 4 years of empty seats. The county could have built him a monument out of the chairs no one would take. Cora watched him from across the hall. She watched the coffee go around, and she watched him not eat, because she was the only one who'd ever noticed that he never ate at these things, that he just sat and waited them out. And she felt the coal in her chest, and she felt her own hands, and she made herself the promise you can only make once. She set down what she was carrying, and she crossed the floor. She came up behind his chair, quiet, from the side where his face was turned away, in the noise and the lamplight where 40 people were laughing and passing plates, and not one of them was watching the deaf man in the corner or the spinster walking toward him. She reached down, and she took his right hand. He startled. Of course he startled. A hand out of nowhere, and he couldn't have heard her come. He half turned, and there was that closed face, ready for whatever public thing was about to be done at him, ready for the slate or the shout. But Cora didn't reach for a slate. She didn't open her mouth. She turned his hand over, gentle, so the palm lay open and upward in the lamplight, and she steadied it. And with the tip of one finger, slow, the way she'd practiced 10,000 times alone in a cold, dark room, she began to trace a single letter onto the 6 inches of skin that no one else in that whole crowded hall could see. She wrote slowly. She had to. Her finger was shaking, and the letters had to be clean or they were nothing at all. She started with a wide, careful stroke down the center of his palm. A line. Then across the top. A T. She waited. She let it sit there a moment so he could feel the shape of it before she moved on. He did not pull his hand away. That was the first miracle. A man who flinched from every touch, who had learned that a hand on his arm meant he was about to be steered or shouted at or spoken for. That man stood with his palm open to the sky and let a woman he barely knew press a letter into his skin. She wrote the second letter. Then the third. Her whole winter was in her finger now. 5 months in a cold room. The mirror. The chart sent from Washington. All of it running out through 6 inches of skin. THEY. Then a space. She lifted her finger clear, so he would know one word had ended and another begun. He was watching her hand, not her face now, her hand. His breath had changed. CANT, space, HEAR, space, THIS. They can't hear this. She reached the end and stopped. She let her finger rest flat against his palm, still, the way you rest a hand on a spooked animal to tell it the danger is done. Emmett Coulter looked up. For 4 years his face had been a shut door. She had watched it close a little more at every supper, every dance, every dinner where his own mother talked over the top of his head. She had watched a young man wall himself up brick by brick until there was nothing left in the window but politeness. And now, something moved behind the glass. His mouth opened. It closed. His eyes went back down to his own hand, as if he did not trust what it had just told him, as if he needed to check that the letters were real and not some cruelty his mind had invented to torment him. He was breathing like a man who had come up out of deep water. Cora turned his hand a little and wrote one more word. Slow, sure, YOU. Just that. You, as in, this is for you. Not the room. Not the county. Not the 40 people eating chicken and pie 10 feet away who had never once thought to say a private thing to the deaf Coulter boy. You, his hand closed. Not to push her away. It closed around her fingers and held them there against his palm. And he bowed his head, and this big silent farmer, who had not let anyone reach him in 4 years, stood in a churchyard and shook. Nobody saw. That was the thing. That was the whole thing. She had built a door that opened into a room only the two of them could stand in, and it opened right there in the middle of a crowd, and not one soul at those tables knew a word had passed between them. He lifted his head. He looked at her, and there was the question again. Bigger now. How? How is this possible? Who taught you? When? She smiled, and her eyes were wet, and she wrote the answer on his palm, one slow letter at a time. WINTER. He stared. ALLWINTER. And she watched him understand it. She watched it land. 5 months. While he had believed the way he had believed for 4 years, that no one in the world was coming, while he had stood at the edge of every gathering, certain of his own solitude, a woman had been sitting alone in a freezing bedroom every single night, tracing letters on her own hand in a mirror, teaching herself to reach him in secret, so that if it failed, he would never know to be disappointed, so that his hope would never be spent on nothing. He had to lean against the table. He did not say anything. He couldn't, but he took her hand, this time, and turned it over, her palm to the sky, and with one blunt, uncertain finger, a finger that had never done this in its life, he pressed a shaky letter into her skin. T. Then he stopped and looked at her, half in terror that he'd done it wrong. She nodded. Go on. Hank. He ran out of room and started again, ashamed of his own clumsiness. You. Thank you. It was the worst handwriting in the state of Indiana. It was the finest sentence Cora Ainsley had ever received in her life. They did not stay long at the supper. A thing that knew cannot bear a crowd. But when the tables were breaking up and the buggies were being hitched in the blue evening, it was Emmett who fell into step beside her. And it was Emmett who, with a jerk of his head, shy as a boy, offered to carry her home. Her father had come in the Dell buggy with the neighbors. She sent word she had a ride. And then she climbed up beside Emmett Coulter into the dark, and the horse took them out onto the Renwick road under a sky going purple to black. And here was the thing she had not planned for. In the dark, a slate is useless. In the dark, lip reading is useless. In the dark, the whole machinery of a deaf man's world goes blind along with everyone else. But not the palm. She reached over in the blackness and found his hand on his knee and turned it up. And she wrote. And he felt every letter as clean as noon. It did not matter that neither of them could see. The channel she had built ran through touch, and touch does not need the sun. She had made a thing that worked in the one place his deafness in the night should have left him most alone, and she had made it without knowing she would ever need it there. She wrote, ISAWOSTRANDER. His hand went hard under hers. She kept going. She told him, letter by letter, mile by mile, the horse walking easy. She told him what she had read off the banker's lips across the counter at Pruitt's store back in the winter. The note, $1,400, due the 1st of June. And the thing Ostrander had said with a little smile to the man beside him, that a deaf man can't hold a note he can't hear called, that the 200 acres would come cheap when the Coulter boy signed or walked. She felt the muscle jump in his jaw. She could not see his face, but she did not need to. He took the reins in one hand and gave her back his other palm, and he wrote, slow and wrong and unmistakable, HOWLONG. She understood the whole of the question. How long have you known? How long have you carried this for me? How long have you been fighting a thing on my behalf that I did not even know was coming? Since the winter, she told him. Since before the mirror worked. He did not write anything back for a long while. The horse's hooves went soft on the dirt. And then he wrote 3 letters, and she had to close her eyes against them. WHY. Why would you? Why me? Why a man the whole county had quietly set aside. She did not have 4 letters for that. She was not sure she had words for it in any form. So she wrote the only true thing. BECAUSEIWANTEDTO. Not because you needed help. Not because I felt sorry. Because I wanted to. Because building the one door nobody else would build into a person nobody else would bother with was the first thing in 29 years she had ever wanted for herself alone. The door grew after that. It grew in centimeters, the way real things grow. It grew in the church pew the next Sunday, where she sat beside him, the empty chair filled at last, in front of the whole congregation. And while the preacher's mouth moved and Emmett heard nothing, she rested her hand on the pew between them and wrote him the sermon in pieces. Not all of it. The good parts. A little wickedly once, she wrote what she thought of Mrs. Dell's hat, and Emmett Coulter, who had not smiled in public in 4 years, put his hand over his mouth in the house of God. It grew at the stove. She took to coming by the Coulter place on some errand of her father's. And Ruth, who had talked over her son's head for 4 years out of a grief she'd never known what to do with. Ruth watched from the doorway the first time Cora stood at Emmett's shoulder at the stove and wrote the day's news onto his palm while he stirred. Ruth had to leave the room. She stood in the yard a while. When she came back, her eyes were red and she said nothing. But she set a third plate at the table without being asked. And she began, haltingly, to try to catch her son's eye before she spoke instead of after. And there were the small things. The things nobody was meant to see. Cora noticed, she had always noticed, that he never ate at the socials, and so at the next one she fixed him a plate and set it in his hands before he could arrange his face into refusal, and stood beside him so he was not on display, and he ate. Emmett noticed, and this undid her, the exact way she took her coffee, and one cold morning at the Coulter table there was a cup already made the way she made it, waiting before she'd said a word. And one afternoon she came home to her father's place and found the sagging gate latch that had hung crooked for 2 years quietly mended. The screws new. No note, no claim of credit. And she stood at that gate a long time with her hand on the fixed latch. Then came the day she wrote him a question that could not be answered with a nod. They were at the Coulter table, the two of them, Ruth gone to the hen house. Cora turned his hand over and wrote, slow, her heart in her throat. WHATDOYOUWANT. And underneath the word she meant the whole world. What do you want, Emmett? Not what will you settle for. Not what has the town decided you may have. What do you want? He could not write that answer. It was too big for a finger. And so Emmett Coulter did the thing he had not done in 3 years. He opened his mouth, and he made his voice work. It came out wrong. He could not hear it to shape it. And it was rough and flat and too loud in places, and the vowels sat crooked. It cost him something terrible. She could see the cost in his neck, in his hands gripping the table's edge, in the fear that at any second she would flinch the way the whole county flinched. He said you. One word. Broken and strange, and the most naked thing a human being had ever handed her. She did not flinch. She put her hand flat against his chest so he could feel it wasn't a shout, and she set it back the only way that mattered, on his palm, pressing each letter home. YOUTOO. Word got around, the way it does. Not the private things, those stayed private. That was the whole point of them. But the town saw the empty chair fill. The town saw the Ainsley girl sitting where nobody had sat. And the town, which had a plan for Cora Ainsley, began to talk. Alton Pruitt came to see her father. A decent man, a widower, the storekeeper, the sensible match the township had penciled in for the spinster years ago. He sat in Harlan Ainsley's parlor with his hat on his knee, and he made his case plainly and without cruelty. A settled home, a store that did well, a life with no strangeness in it, no note coming due, no county whispering. He was not wrong about any of it. He was offering her exactly the life a woman in her position was supposed to take with both hands and gratitude. Her father wanted it for her. Harlan was not a hard man, but he was tired, and he was afraid for her, and he said the thing plainly one night at their own stove, that she was throwing herself away on the deaf Coulter boy, that a farm under a foreclosure note was no place to land, that people were saying she'd gone and made a project of a broken man and would spend her life as his ears. His ears. There it was. The word the whole thing turned on. And then, at the sale barn, they saw what she'd really built. It was the spring cattle sale, the big one. Emmett's own steers going through the ring. For 4 years, Roy Tanner had done all of Emmett's talking here. Roy read the auctioneer. Roy raised the hand. Roy bought and sold a mute man's stock over the mute man's own head, while Emmett stood there like a fence post at his own business. Not this time. Cora stood at Emmett's shoulder, and as the auctioneer's mouth ran, that impossible flood of numbers no deaf man on earth could read off lips. Cora wrote the bids on Emmett's palm. Fast now. She'd drilled the numbers all week. 240, 250, 260, and a man in back. And Emmett, reading his own sale off his own hand, raised his own arm and bid on his own cattle for the first time since the war. Roy Tanner's hand came halfway up out of pure habit, and then Roy saw, and Roy stepped back. Stepped clear back. And the man who had done all the talking for 4 years found for once that he had nothing to say. Vern Ostrander was there, along the rail. He had come to watch a deaf man flounder. He watched instead a deaf man work his own numbers clean and sharp, cattle money stacking up green in front of the whole county, and Ostrander's smooth face did a thing it was not used to doing. It got uneasy, but the world does not hand you a thing that good without sending the reckoning right behind it. And the reckoning came the way Emmett's wounds always came, through the eyes. Because Emmett Coulter could read lips now too. She had never thought about that. She had built him a channel to receive her, and she had forgotten it also let him receive everyone. And at the edge of that sale, over the churn of the crowd, Emmett watched 2 men by the pens make their mouths move. He watched them look at him and at Cora, and back again. He read every word off their lips as plain as a printed page. The spinster and the deaf man. Charity, pity dressed up as courtship. Ostrander himself, adding the last twist of the knife with a little smile. That she'd taken him on the way you'd take on a stray, and that no woman learns a thing like that for love. Only for the good feeling of being needed. Cora saw his face close. She saw the door she had spent 5 months and a whole winter prying open. She saw it swing shut. Right there. Brick going back over the window. He walked to Roy's wagon. He took the slate. The slate, the old public voice. The cold, flat thing anyone could read over your shoulder. The very emblem of a man who could never be told anything in private. He had not touched it in weeks. He picked up the chalk on its string, and he wrote one hard line, pressing so the chalk squealed, and he turned it around and held it up so that Cora and the men near her, and anyone who cared to look, could all read it at once. I won't be anyone's project. And then he set the slate down, and he did not offer her his palm, and he walked out to hitch his team alone. She let him go. That was the terrible, grown thing she made herself do. She did not chase him across the sale yard and make a scene that would only prove the town's word right. She gathered her dignity around her like a coat, and she walked out with her chin level and her eyes dry until she was well down the road, and only then did she let it break. June crept up, the first of the month, and the note poised over the farm like a raised hand. Ostrander circling, patient, certain now that the strange spell had broken, and the deaf man was alone again, and would sign or walk the way he'd always meant him to. Emmett silent on his 200 acres. Cora back at her father's stove, making coffee for one, the mirror in her cold room facing the wall. Alton Pruitt was patient too. He did not press. He only waited, decent and steady, for the sensible thing to finish happening. But here's what the town did not know. Because the town never knew any of the things that mattered about Emmett Coulter. It did not know what he did on the settlement morning. He walked into the Tipton Farmers Trust alone. No Roy, no Cora, no slate. He walked up to the counter where Vern Ostrander sat, and Ostrander smiled and slid the papers over. The pen laid across them, just so. Everything ready for a deaf man to sign his farm away, because he couldn't hear the note called. And Emmett Coulter reached into his coat, and he laid down $1,400. Cattle, money. His own. Earned in a ring he'd worked with his own 2 hands and read off his own palm. Every bid his, every dollar his. He counted it out on the counter in front of the clerk, slow, so there'd be no mistake, and he pushed it across, and he took the pen and turned the paper over and wrote in a steady farmer's hand, "Paid in full. Note discharged." Then he looked Verna Strander in the eye. The first time he'd ever looked that man straight in the eye, and he waited. Ostrander's mouth opened. Whatever came out of it, Emmett couldn't hear, and for once in his life, he was glad of it. He watched the smooth face fall apart. He watched the bet collapse right there on the counter, with the clerk standing witness. And then Emmett Coulter took his receipt, and put his hat on, and walked out of the trust a man who owned his own ground, free and clear. He had proven he could hold the note. He had one thing left to prove, and it wasn't to Ostrander. The June box supper filled the Renwick Grange hall. Same room, same long tables, same 40 faces, near enough, the Dells and the Pruitts and the Tanners, Ruth in the corner, the young girls in their good dresses, who had spent 4 years not sitting in the chair beside the deaf Coulter boy. And there he sat, in his usual place at the end, the empty chair beside him the way it had always been, a cup in his hand he wasn't drinking from. The door opened, and Cora Ainsley came in. The room noticed. Rooms always notice. There was that little drop in the talk, that turn of heads, the whole township watching to see whether the spinster would do the sensible thing at last, or make a fool of herself one more time over a man who'd held up a slate in a sale yard and told her no. She did not stop for any of them. She crossed the floor of that hall. The same floor where a neighbor had once cupped his hands and bellowed a kindness that shut Emmett's face for 4 years. She crossed it slow and level, past the tables, past Alton Pruitt with his hat in his hands, right up to the end where Emmett sat. He looked up at her. The old shut politeness came over his face, the expecting nothing look. He had told her no. He had every reason to think she'd come to argue, or worse, to pity him in front of everyone. Cora reached down. In front of every soul in that hall, in front of the 40 who had watched him spoken at, and shouted at and spoken over for 4 years and never once spoken to, she took Emmett Coulter's rough hand and turned it over. Palm up, open to the light. The room went dead quiet. Nobody understood it. That was the beauty of it. They saw a woman take a man's hand and stare at it, and they leaned in, and they had no idea on God's earth what they were watching. She lifted one finger. She touched it to the center of his palm. They had shouted at him for 4 years so the whole room could hear. She was the first to say something meant for no one but him. S. She wrote it slow and clean. T. His breath caught. A. His eyes came up to her face. And the door was open. Wide open. No bricks left at all. Y. Stay. 4 letters. 1 word. The whole township watching her mouth to hear what she was telling him. And not one of them heard a thing. Because she hadn't said it with her mouth. She'd said it with her hand, into his hand, in the one language in that entire hall that belonged to the 2 of them alone. And Emmett Coulter, in a room that had made him mute for 4 years, opened his mouth and answered out loud. Yes, rough, flat, too loud and crooked, and the most beautiful word ever spoken in the Renwick Grange Hall. He said it so the whole room could hear. He gave them that, on purpose, the one word, because some things you say in the palm and one thing you say out loud, so the world has to witness it. In the corner, Ruth Coulter put her face in her hands and wept, because her son had spoken. Her son had answered. Her son had come back from wherever he'd gone 4 years ago in the mud near Exermont. Alton Pruitt looked at the 2 of them a long moment. Then he set his hat on his head, gave a small nod that nobody but Cora caught, and stepped back with the kind of grace that is its own quiet dignity. He was a good man. He lost like one. Roy Tanner, who had done all of Emmett's talking for 4 years, stood by the wall with the old slate nowhere in sight and found he had nothing left to say, because his friend had finally found someone to say things for himself to. And the young girls, the ones in their good dresses, looked at that filled chair, and at the empty one that had sat beside it for 4 years, and some of them, maybe, understood for the first time what the emptiness had cost. Verna Strander was not there. A strander was gone from Tipton County by harvest. The note paid, the bet lost. The smooth talk taken somewhere it hadn't yet been found out. 6 months on, there was a lit house on 200 acres in Renwick. Their house. The table set for two, the lamp warm, the winter coming down soft and quiet outside the way winters do. The slate lived in a drawer now. Cora had put it there herself, and Emmett had let her, because the palm was enough. Because a man does not need the public voice. The flat, cold thing everyone reads over his shoulder, when he has a private one that runs through 6 inches of skin and belongs to no one but his wife. That last night of the story, the lamp was low and the room near dark, and Emmett sat by the fire he could not hear crackle. Cora came up behind his chair. She did not turn on more light. She did not need to. She reached over his shoulder and found his hand in the dark and turned it up. They thought, all of them for 4 years, that what he needed was help hearing. They were wrong. He never needed to hear. He needed somewhere to be told a secret. She wrote it now, in the dark, with her fingertip, and not one other person in all the world heard the word, and his hand closed warm around hers, and he had heard it perfectly. If you know a town like Renwick, the kind where a chair stays empty and everyone agrees not to see it, tell me the name of yours in the comments.